I'm not using any slides, but I have got a copy of Poetry Wales with me if anyone wants to look at that afterwards. For a while now, I've wanted to place some writing about poetry and disability within a mainstream poetry journal. Over the last year, I've been pursuing Poetry Wales over an article published in their Winter 2014 issue. I wrote to the editor, Nia Davis, in March, querying a misjudged colloquial metaphor that Graham Harthill had used in a feature. He stated that poetry, quote, can tell truths to which we are otherwise deaf, close quotes. I suggested that this was an ill-judged metaphor and explained why, which I don't think I need to do here. There was no reply, but I waited patiently. Over the summer, I decided to return to the theme of poetry and disability and write a short article accompanied by some brief reviews of poetry collections that could illustrate the points I wanted to make. Still waiting on Poetry Wales' response, I sent this feature to Poetry London at the end of July. I then tried PN Review and Poetry Review at the end of August. In September, Nia Davis from Poetry Wales finally emailed me apologising for the 6-month delay, and her email said, I'm so happy to receive your letter. I've been thinking about this issue as an editor, trying to keep an open awareness out for metaphors that use disability thoughtlessly, so I'm particularly sorry I didn't pick up on this in Graham's article. So I'm grateful to you for pointing this out and that you took the time to write. I am indeed interested in a short feature on poetry and disability. I read the recent discussion in Poetry US magazine with interest and wondered how such a conversation could be placed in a British-Welsh context. This was really promising, but I was now worried about the other 3 magazines that I'd written to. Eventually, Michael Schmidt of PN Review replied on the 16th of October, and this is the letter in full, bar his sign-off. I was interested to read your review of the 4 books, but sad that it did not link them more. It reads more like for discrete review than a continuous consideration. I was full of hope that poetry and disability metaphor would address directly an issue we are very keen to explore. But since you started from a critic rather than a poet, the engagement seemed to be more with how we talk about poetry than how poetry entails and embodies disability. Clearly, the insensitive use of disability terms as pejoratives in criticism is, as you kindly put it, colloquial, but your theme seems to be more criticism and disability metaphor than poetry. To which I would argue his magazine publishes work that is criticism or is about language, so why couldn't the piece start by introducing a critic who has misused language and then continue to the mini-reviews? And the point of the discrete reviews was to suggest how other reviewers might incorporate some disability-lit awareness. Finally, I wondered why Schmidt did not suggest we simply change the title of the piece to something like Poetry Criticism and Disability Tropes, if he was concerned that my title was misleading. I resisted emailing Professor Schmidt these thoughts as I thought it would only get me into trouble. With the encouragement from Nia Davis, I sent in my feature plus the 4 mini-reviews. She responded, I've reread the piece and would like to publish it with a light edit, if that's okay. For print, I'll probably have to split the article to place the reviews in the review section, but I could put the article right next to it so it's not too separate. What do you think? This does seem a shame in some ways because the article seems to ask a question which is then answered in part by the reviews. This was wonderful because she appeared to have grasped what Schmidt did not. The purpose of the particular reviews was to illustrate my ideas in the article. Davis concluded, actually I was wondering if the essay could in fact touch on the potential for new ideas, narratives, methods, etc., which could come from hearing more from writers on the receiving end of illness and disability, which would take it a step further, something which the perspectives on Siegel and Bernhope do explore. So, a cause for celebration, I think. I'm going to conclude the talk by reading extracts from the 4 reviews. The article that prefaces them it would be very much preaching to the converted here, and there isn't time to read both. So, Kelly Swain's Opera di Sera is a tragic verse drama set in 18th century Florence, where an anatomical figure of Venus is being created by the sculptor Susini. Amidst the gruesome poetry of dissection, artist model Teresa is attracted to the man who sketches her. Kelly's erotic poems are enticing. Your fingers strum, scrape, my lemon pith is sweet, you are salt thick and I grow parched on you. The servant, Cintio, breaks the spell of that fine language at a publicly staged vivisection. See this stray bitch tied down. He later describes a pregnancy that fails to hold as rotten, creating anxiety in the reader as Teresa has fallen pregnant. Museum director Fontana and Cintio decide to feed Teresa pennyroyal, a herb known to encourage miscarriage, in order to create a perfect dead model for the waxwork fetus. Teresa's baby does miscarry and then she dies too. Sozzini mourns over their corpses and then strangles Cintio in retribution. The story works as both poetry and page-turning tragic drama, but where the collection jarred was when Cintio is revealed to be a man with a scarred face. Quote, "I am a devilish Cupid, is their purity soiled by the gaze of my ruined face?" Close quote. We're presented with the archetypal vengeful disabled villain who apparently seeks to hurt others as he himself has been hurt. The scarred face is a cliché of horror, and we no longer think that the outer ruined body reflects the inner ruined soul, do we? So rather than heightening the book's intensity, the cliché of disabled characterisation turns the poetry into melodrama. Had Cintio been scarred but not evil, or evil and not scarred, then this otherwise hugely enjoyable verse novel would have been less predictable. The Forward Prize-winning Small Hands by Mona Arshi is a sustained narrative of loss and grieving. It's an intriguing and powerful first collection that notices small absurdities around the death of her brother. But one poem troubled me. Gloves is a prose poem where the narrator and her mother buy leather gloves whilst on holiday. Back at their hotel, the manager asks how their day has been. Quote, "It was then that we noticed her left hand was missing. In fact, a good portion of her arm was missing below the elbow, and the skin had been neatly folded and tucked in." I like the matter-of-fact tone used here and the insistence that this did not affect the woman's ability to work, specifically to type, although realistically being one-handed does cause fatigue when typing. The mother's response to the woman's disability is to ask her daughter to get rid of the gloves. The daughter takes the gloves out to a car and then looks up to see her mother on the balcony, quote, "Still sitting there in the fine rain, wrapped up in that stupid shawl, and she's crying, not caring if the wind disturbs her face." A beautiful ending, but despite the poet's endeavours to destigmatise the hotel manager's unusual arm, the mother has clearly invested meaning in it, thereby replicating one of the problems faced by disabled people, the desire of others to read meaning, frequently tinged by sadness or horror, into what is, for them, an ordinary reality. The poem could make a reader reflect on this, but it's far more likely that the reader will think about this mother, the loss of her son, the loss of the other woman's hand, than think how clever they are making the connections. But what if the hotel manager was born with her limb configured that way? She had not experienced the anomaly as loss, but as difference. This may be a poem made from life writing, but more could have been done to avoid the image replicating an overused metaphor. Also shortlisted for the Forward Prize was Matthew Siegel's Blood Work. The reader gathers that Siegel is living with an illness with disabling consequences. As life writing, his illness story is not one of discovery, investigation, diagnosis, treatment and then recovery, the triumph over tragedy narrative arc, nor is it an elegy. It is more elliptical, complex and circling. Siegel's pills are like something out of Disney and, quote, "doze until I wake them." In this collection, scarring is almost given meaning, but then it's avoided in the nick of time. Quote, "You press a scar on my back with your finger. I tell you the sky broke and some pieces fell on me as I slept shirtless in the sun, my belly against the grass. Each opens a small door in my body if you touch with your tongue." This is the body as vulnerable and enticing. It suggested to me an urge to get beyond the explanation of scars, illness or disability and move instead towards sensuality. Yet the poet admits that caught in this tactile situation, quote, "I don't say any of this." The title, What I Failed to Mention, reinforces that omission. Finally, Mark Burnhope, a poet who co-edited the anthology Fit to Work, Poets Against Atos in 2013. We might expect him to make challenging politicised connections beyond the first-person lyric, and he does this with poems about the Paralympics and in the hilarious Am I Disabled? A Self-Diagnosis questionnaire. Burnhope also addresses the most famous of disabled kings in To My Parallel Parked King, Richard III. Richard's body was pulled from a car park in 2012, and the Hunchback King, previously read as exaggeration, was now found to be fact. Burnhope reproduces Shakespeare's description of the king. Cheated of feature, deformed, unfinished we have called ourselves. Hedgehog, bottled spider, foul bunchback toad, diffused infection of a man. After this horror, the poet declares his solidarity with Richard. Mark, for all the names they gave me, we may as well have been buried beside ourselves. One cockatrice, dry-cured, butterflied, fossilised, to rule them all. As well as the play on Burnhope's first name, Mark, with the mark of stigma and name-calling, the lines conjure up a defiant or cocky ruler. Burnhope is best at creating poems with a sense of tenderness that nevertheless contain kernels of justified anger. At the end of the above poem, even though your scoliosis was found to be mild, meaning little strain on arms in battle, neither withered in any way. Yea, we can be reasonably confident they have worked about us without us. My kinsmen in this farce, I would have kept them from you if I could have. It may help to know on reading the central lines above that one of the slogans of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us, here transposed as they have worked about us without us. The slogan insists upon returning expertise and decision-making to disabled people. The poem seems to suggest that Richard's disabled kin were not consulted as to his exhumation, although their bloodline kin did seem to be involved. Burnhope seems to be asking questions of society as well as poetry. Who gives permission? Who writes the poem? If reviewers continue to avoid the discussion of disability and atypical bodies and minds in poetry, then his questions will continue to fall, no, not on deaf ears, but to the wayside.